Patty was a very caring and loving person. She was a good mom.
They were fighting, they had an argument because she had been drinking. All of a sudden he heard like a swishing sound and they were both sucked under.
It would have been a minute or two of sheer terror.
Underwater, in the dark, while you're sort of panicked, would be hard to escape from.
They called my mom down, and my mom identified her.
Patty was speaking out from the grave.
We got tricked.
That son of a bitch did it. He killed my sister.
Every murder is a mystery. But a victim's body is a sea of evidence. Every fiber is a clue. Every wound, a piece of the puzzle. The medical examiner holds the key to unlock their stories and catch a killer. This is Secrets of the Morgue.
It's a little hamlet. There's no traffic light in Guilford. 1,200 residents, rural community, kind of the salt of the earth, really. We had all the big city crimes just in small doses.
Late one night, a terrible accident shocks the town.
Yes, I'd like to report an emergency.
What is the emergency?
The car flipped upside down in the water.
Is anybody in it?
Yes, there's a woman in it right now. It's at Guilford Lake.
Do you know if the woman's out yet?
No, we can't get her out.
Okay.
Our patrol arrived first, right along with the Guilford Fire Department.
What I was told was there was a truck that had gone into the lake. There are fire vehicles on the far end of the scene, a couple of people that are in the roadway.
On the shore, the truck's owner, Peter Wojcik, is hysterical.
His wife is still in the lake. He was kind of running around. We didn't want him getting hurt, so we put him in the back stroker so we know where he was.
A police diver enters the freezing water to search for Peter's wife, Patty, who's believed to be trapped inside the truck.
He was able to locate Patty. He brought her directly to the surface. The boat come over. They picked Patty up out of the water. An EMT was in the boat. He immediately started CPR and did it all the way to the shore.
First responders do everything they can to save Patty's life.
There was no pulse. Their protocol, because it is cold water, being a cold water drowning, they continued CPR, loaded her directly in the ambulance, and went directly to Sydney Hospital.
Although someone has been submerged for a long time, they've been in cold water, and because of that cold water, they can actually survive. The cold water induces a reflex in people called the diving reflex, which basically slows down the metabolism. Cold water drowning survivors have been known to be submerged for an hour or more.
Patty is rushed to the same hospital that she works at as a nurse.
They were still in the life-saving mode, so there was a code, obviously. They all came down. They were all trying to do whatever they could.
An hour later, Patricia Wojcik is pronounced dead. Police now have to determine how this beloved mother of three ended up at the bottom of Guilford Lake.
My grandfather was a police officer for a little village in the Berock Police Department. I've always had that drive to be competitive, to be good, get the truth, and to help folks. Car accidents, domestics, lost children, all that, it's just helping people.
Detective Lloyd's first job is one of the toughest, interviewing the lone survivor and husband of the victim, Peter Wojcik.
His initial report was that his wife returned from work. She had forgot to pick up their children, who were at the babysitter's house in Guilford. So they got into the truck. Patty was driving the vehicle, and she went to put a cigarette out the window, and as she did, she had looked back, and as she looked forward, there's a deer standing in the middle of the road. So he said that she swung to the left hard, back to the right hard, slid sideways, over the bank and into the lake.
Then, Peter reveals the harrowing moment when water starts gushing into the cab.
With his left hand, he grabbed Patty by the jacket, and he was pulling her out when all of a sudden he heard like a swooshing sound, and they were both sucked under. He couldn't hang on to her, and the next thing he knows, he's under the truck, underwater. He follows the drive shaft out to the tailgate and is completely underwater, he said, for 40 seconds. He gets to the top of the surface, he's screaming her name, dives back down. He can't get all the way back down to the truck because it's so cold. He gets out of the water, yells for her, can't find her, can't locate her. He goes up onto 3 cabins and bangs on a door, wakes them up, explains to them that they got in an accident, his wife is still in the lake.
It's a tragic accident. A woman devoted to her family and community, taken in the prime of her life.
Patty was a very caring and loving person. She was a good mom. Patty worked in the ER. She enjoyed working there, being able to care for people. Patty had just gotten off work. She finished her shift. She'd worked 3 to 11 that day. And my mother was a night nurse at the hospital. She worked 11 to 7. She was on that night. And they called my mom down, and my mom identified her.
While the family grieves, the incident undergoes a thorough investigation.
The sheriff's department at that point had nobody trained to do advanced accident investigation or accident reconstruction.
Lieutenant Cobb was a young deputy and a newly trained accident investigator at the time.
I liked putting the pieces back together in an incident and taking that to a prosecution. You got to pay attention. You can't take things for granted at the scene. One of the things that I noticed in my walkthrough was that entire side of Guilford Lake is either protected by guide rails or there's houses or cabins. There are very few openings along that side of the lake. This one that the truck went through is the only one that would allow access to the water without striking another object, guide rails or a house. I'm not an odds maker, but it would be highly unusual, and you'd have to be very unlucky if you were going to have an accident in that area to hit that one opening where something wouldn't stop you from going in the water.
How does someone have a car accident into Guilford Lake when there's only 33 feet that is unprotected by guardrail?
We're already starting to question, how did this really happen?
The detectives interview first responders to ask about Peter's state of mind.
A fireman had first contact because he knew Peter, and he told that fireman that he was driving. And then when the police got there, then it was she was driving.
Peter admits to changing his story to protect Patty.
Patty had some alcohol problems in the past. They were fighting, they had an argument because she had been drinking.
Peter did change the story to say that he lied to cover up for Patty, that she was driving drunk and crashed.
Patty's long struggle with alcohol is well known to her friends and family.
In high school, she ended up pregnant. She was under a lot of stress, and that's where the alcohol started coming in when she was 18. When she received her 5th DWI, the judge said, you either do a 28-day stay in a program and get yourself straightened out, or you go to jail for 100 days. And she did. She did the 28-day stay, and she sobered up, and that was it. She ended up becoming a full-time student and working full-time as a nurse's aide. She had gone from being an alcoholic and made something else her focus.
But if Patty was drinking again, why did Peter let her drive drunk? Police hope the autopsy performed by medical examiner Dr. James Terzian will give them some answers.
I estimate that I've done some 4,000 autopsies in my life. Solving puzzles is something that a lot of forensic pathologists like to do. And helping bring justice when there's a wrong being committed. Only a few hours had elapsed since the vehicle went into the water and the body was brought to me. On her face, she had a number of abrasions and contusions, or scrapes and bruises, over her right forehead, on her left chin area, and also on her upper lip. And on the inside of her upper lip, she had a couple of small lacerations or cuts. All kinds of injuries can occur in car crashes. So that did not ring any particular bell for me as to exactly what had happened.
Investigators want to know if Patty was impaired when the truck drove into the lake.
I opened the body and looked internally at the organs, sampled the organs, sampled the body fluids for toxicology, and I immediately got a result back on the blood. It was 0.055. It varies from person to person how we handle alcohol. It also depends whether a person has taken in food at the same time. But generally, if she had 2 drinks in an hour, you might get a level of 0.05 like she had.
0.055, it wouldn't have been illegal at the time.
To me, this didn't look like it happened the way Peter said it did.
We're seeing things that doesn't add up.
Detectives investigating the tragic death of mother of 3, Patty Wojcik, are concerned that her husband Peter's story keeps changing. They interview the couple who helped Peter right after the truck crashed into the lake.
We interviewed Jessica and Tom, the people from the cabin. Jessica says when he came to the house, his hair was dry and his hair didn't look messed at all. His hair was, like she called it, feathered. He had kind of a mullet and it wasn't messed up. It was just like you would see him on the street. When Jessica and Tom tried to go into the water, he was telling them not to because he didn't want them to get hurt. Be careful, don't go in there, it's too cold.
Nurses at the hospital also claim Peter acted strangely the night of the accident.
It was cold water, so you don't pronounce him deceased until the body comes back to temperature. So there was a period of time when they were working on Patty to try to save her, even though it was futile. And he was making comments like, nobody's paying attention to me, when he didn't need any attention.
But there is a problem with Peter's vitals when he's checked out by a doctor.
His blood pressure was normal. His temperature was almost normal. Anyone that would have been in the water would have seen some signs of hypothermia.
In hypothermia from being immersed in cold water, the body temperature drops, and so the body tries to compensate by producing heat. And how does it do that? By shivering. The body is trying to create friction to raise the temperature back to normal. Well, if he had come out of the water after being completely doused, he would be shivering. It would be hard for him to talk clearly.
He showed no signs of hypothermia.
Detectives suspect that the crash wasn't an accident. They look to Dr. Terzian to confirm Patty's cause of death.
I noticed that there was some hemorrhage or bleeding on the undersurface of her breastbone. Initially, I thought perhaps the bleeding on the undersurface of the breastbone was related to the resuscitation efforts because in the process, oftentimes ribs or the sternum are fractured. There weren't any severe injuries on the inside of her body, but there were some injuries, including some petechial or microhemorrhages on her lungs and also on her esophagus. Petechiae, or microhemorrhages, occur when there is vascular congestion and hypoxia, or lack of oxygen.
A loss of oxygen makes sense if Patty drowned. But the diagnosis is one of the toughest for a forensic pathologist to make.
You know, drowning, it's interesting. Drowning is a death that really is a mechanism that has to be proved by ruling out every other possible cause of death. There's no single finding in a drowning that will prove that someone died of drowning. You have to rule out everything else.
Dr. Terzian takes a closer look at Patty's lungs for any abnormal signs.
In bodies that are pulled out of water, normally we expect to find a lot of water in the lungs because people breathe in the water and it fills up their lungs, and so the air gets replaced by water. It's pretty simple. However, in this case, there really wasn't too much extra fluid in her lungs. That's not impossible with drowning situations. Some people describe a situation called dry drowning.
Dry drowning is a condition in which an individual is submerged underwater, and yet autopsy examination reveals that even though they were submerged, water did not get into their lungs, and they do not have the typical findings of drowning. The theory is that in the drowning process, this particular individual had a spasm of their larynx, preventing water from getting into their lungs.
Dry drowning is rare. It's so rare, in fact, that when we see a case like that, we always have to ask ourselves, was the person really deceased before they actually entered the water?
Dr. Terzian labeled it probable drowning. And in his initial report, he indicated on there that he observed several abrasions, scrapes and bruises. And that's when I connected with him to say, how does she get these injuries to her?
If she has these injuries and was in the same truck as Pete, going in at the same speed in the same water with no seatbelt, why doesn't he have any injury?
At the scene of the tragedy, Cobb begins his own forensic examination, reconstructing the accident the way Peter described it.
Part of the story with the swerving to miss a deer that had crossed the roadway, we had initial doubt on that. We had a New York State Environmental Conservation police officer come to the scene. So the officer conducted an investigation of the area. We didn't see any signs of deer. There were no deer prints in the dirt. There were no deer feces, anything like that.
Cobb studies skid marks left by the truck's tires to see exactly how the truck swerved into Guilford Lake.
It was a Chevy dual-wheel, a king cab pickup truck, so it had 4 tires on the back, 2 on each side. On the scene, there was a dual-wheel dirt impression.
Tire tracks are like fingerprints and can determine the speed of the truck when it left the road and hit the water.
I found this tire marker, which would be the direction that the velocity vehicle was traveling. It rolled through the dirt for several yards and then made this gradual left turn across the pavement. It was like an ink roller, rolling ink and running out of ink. That gave me a curve or an arc that I could measure and then use in the critical curve speed formula. In this case, it was somewhere around 30 miles per hour. Peter's statement was that they were going 50 to 55. Clearly, if they were going 50 or 55, they wouldn't have made the turn that they made. There would have been skid marks, scuff marks from the tires. So as I'm walking through the scene, I'm looking for those skid marks, and I don't see them. I don't see any tearing of the grass or skidding across the lawn that I think I should see.
No skid marks point to another glaring inconsistency inside the truck.
I've investigated enough crashes that 50 to 55 miles an hour with unbelted occupants, there's damage inside of a vehicle. I'm looking through the truck, I don't see any damage anywhere. The steering wheel doesn't look broken, the windshield's not broken, the rearview mirror is still in place on the windshield. There is no damage inside this truck.
But there is evidence to support the suspicion that Patty wasn't driving.
The driver's window is down, which is somewhere between 10 and 11 inches, which is a pretty narrow opening. Underwater, in the dark, while you're sort of panicked, would be hard to escape from. I noticed that the passenger door is still locked. When Patty was discovered by the state police divers, she was found outside the cab. Actually, she was about 10 feet behind the truck toward shore. So that was interesting to us in that Peter's story was that he couldn't get her out, but yeah, she was outside the vehicle. That just didn't make sense to us.
The accident reconstruction calls much of Peter's story into question. Then, Dr. Terzian discovers another inconsistency.
I found plant material in the hair, which turned out to be something called burdocks. Burdocks are spiny little plant forms that get stuck on your clothing when you walk through an open field. People don't walk around with this kind of thing on their clothing, and she had them all over her clothing and in her hair. So I said to myself, well, why does she have these? Do these come from the bottom of a lake? Are there burdock bushes at the edge of the lake? I did tell the authorities, and I said to them, well, go back to the lake, take a botanist with you, and find out where these came from.
We had a botanist from Binghamton University come up, and he surveyed that whole scene, and he did not find any burdock plants within 100 yards of the accident scene. And burdocks does not grow in water.
The burdocks add another layer of mystery to the growing list of inconsistencies. Patty may have died before the truck crashed into the lake.
The whole description of the accident is not there. The event at Guilford Lake is an absolutely staged event. Everything that happened to her had to happen away from Guilford Lake. We got tricked.
Detectives in upstate New York believe Patty Wojcik's death was staged. A new tip about the relationship between Patty and her husband Peter makes him the prime suspect.
Clarence Edick was a hunter, and somewhere up in November of 2001, Mr. Edick was hunting behind the Wojcik property. And he was trying to find a deer, and on a ridge above the house, he saw Mr. Wojcik come out the back door with Patty and the two kids. As he saw Mr. Wojcik scream to her, "I'm gonna kill you," and then punch her in the face. And that's the beginning of a very, very big circumstantial case.
They reach out to the community for more witnesses to corroborate Peter's violent behavior.
We interviewed coworkers, and it's a small hospital. Everybody knew her mom, and a lot of people knew Patty's struggles. Not only her own personal struggles, but they knew the struggles she had with Pete. Pete and Patty's marriage was violent. People had seen where she'd come in with bruises on her arms or on her back.
Police turn to Patty's sister Wendy to confirm the abuse.
I didn't know that there was physical at this point in time. I knew that there was mental abuse, and there was verbal abuse because they would get into altercations, verbal altercations, where, he would call her names and, tell her she was stupid. Mind you, Pete had always said that she would never leave him. She would never take his children, because if she did, he'd find her and kill her. And that was kind of like, whoa.
One of her close friends even said Patty had diaries. When we got that information, we talked with the district attorney, and we said, boy, we need to really look into this.
And we wanted to get those diaries to see what, in fact, that they told us.
We went to the house, and we found several diaries. Some were in her bedroom, Some were in a closet, and several entries in there. And one that I still remember to this day said that, "At times I fear Pete will kill me one of these days."
It's very, very powerful when you receive the most important information from the person who has actually been killed. She had documented the abuse that she received from her husband and how it continued to get worse. Patty was speaking out from the grave.
The diaries point to a new suspect and a shocking new motive.
Joyce Warden was their babysitter, watched their girls, was friends with both of them, Patty and Pete. What we were able to determine is that from reading the diaries, at one point, Patty was desperate to do whatever she could to keep Pete happy, to keep their relationship alive. So she actually brought Joyce into their marriage, sexually, romantically, and they started a three-way relationship with each other.
Love triangles generally start as purely a physical attraction. And for many, that's fine, providing it stays completely physical. But what can often happen is that the physical leads to emotional. And somebody is going to be left out, somebody is going to be jealous, and someone is going to want to take out their jealousy and their rage towards the third person. And it's not unusual for the third person that's been brought in to want to stay permanently, and that means the elimination of the third. And that's where murder comes in.
Reading the diaries and talking to the people that knew Patty the best, that relationship quickly turned from a three to just Joyce and Pete. And Patty was the one left out.
She felt that Peter was moving away from her and moving more towards his girlfriend, and that she felt that she wasn't safe and that she was afraid for her life while being with him.
Detectives need to know if Joyce is involved in Patty's death. They bring her in for questioning.
Whatever Joyce did or didn't do that night was looked at under the microscope.
Joyce seemed to be forthcoming. She believed it was an accident. She was able to confirm the relationship, that it had gone from a three-way to just solely Pete and her. She denied and maintained that she didn't know anything.
Joyce was the one watching the kids.
Detectives are convinced Patty's death isn't an accident and that Peter is involved. They need the medical examiner to prove it.
We asked him to re-examine the body, this time with the additional information that we had.
The body was brought back to see if anything was missed. You could call it a second autopsy or a second look.
Now that police suspect the accident was staged, Dr. Terzian rechecks the first autopsy for any suspicious findings.
Initially, I thought perhaps the bleeding on the undersurface of the breastbone was related to the resuscitation efforts, but in retrospect, her circulatory system could have stopped long before that, and it would be unusual to get much hemorrhage on the undersurface of a breastbone in someone who was essentially already dead for several minutes.
He sees that Patty's injuries could have been caused by an assault and not the accident.
I looked more carefully at the neck organs, the hyoid bone in particular, and the tongue, things that I don't necessarily always take out of a body. There was really no bruising on the skin of her neck or on the muscles of her neck. There was no fracture of her hyoid bone in her neck or her laryngeal cartilages. This did not seem to be a manual strangulation of her neck. It really was more consistent with something being held over the nose and mouth. Asphyxiation is the term that we use. The bleeding under the chest plate suggested that the breastplate was fractured as part of the suffocation process. It occurred because someone was either kneeling on her or lying on top of her. She was not a very big woman, about 120 pounds, 5'7". She was thin. Something was held over her nose and mouth, probably a hand, which accounts for the trauma to her lips and the bleeding. There was no other explanation for this. There's no doubt in my mind that Patty was murdered
Forensic pathologist Dr. James Terzian's second autopsy of Patty Wojcik has ruled out drowning as her cause of death.
It became quite clear to me, because she didn't have any severe injuries or obvious drowning from the lake, that she probably was dead before the vehicle ever got into the lake.
He's convinced that the forensic evidence points to her husband, Peter, as her killer.
Asphyxial deaths probably take a minute or two before someone becomes unconscious. Once you cut off your air supply, eventually the brain becomes hypoxic and you lose consciousness. But it would have been a minute or two of sheer terror knowing what was happening to her. And then I think he tried to cover up the crime by putting her into a vehicle and driving the vehicle into a lake, because somehow he knew that it would be hard to separate drowning from asphyxiation.
To make an arrest, investigators need to know where Patty was killed. Dr. Terzian may have a clue.
Something was wrong here with the story versus the findings. When the body came to me, what I noticed was that there were these plant materials on her clothing. I mean, she shouldn't have had these burdocks on her clothing and in her hair. Where are these coming from?
We'd already known from the lake the burdocks wasn't there, so she had been into this burdocks in some way, and if it wasn't at the lake, then where did it happen?
We received a second search warrant to specifically look for the burdocks around the Wojcik property.
Right away, I saw the burdocks were all over the place. They were in brush on the side of the yard.
We actually found one burdock plant in the backyard, one that looked like half it was gone and been trampled down.
The little burrs themselves were missing off basically one whole side of the bush.
When we looked at that closer, we found her hairs were embedded in one of the branches.
And I saw that there were some hairs consistent with the victim's hairs. We were able to find hairs in the burdocks and the bushes that matched Patty's hair.
That's where he attacked her, got her down on the ground, and that's where the burdock was transferred. She got attacked and murdered at her home.
In a way, it was a good feeling because I knew that we were going to be able to prosecute Peter and not let him get away with this. But the flip side of that is, obviously, this is where Patty died. This is, you know, this is the spot. That's sort of tough.
But investigators aren't ready to make an arrest. To ensure a killer doesn't escape justice, they need one more answer.
What would be motive?
District Attorney Joseph McBride has a theory about why Patty was murdered.
Peter Wojcik had a bar called the Angel Inn that was in Guilford, and he was trying to expand it. And our position was that he killed Patty for the insurance proceeds.
Financially motivated murders are difficult to prove. You need to be able to prove if the spouse is reporting them dead through unforeseen circumstances or unexplained circumstances, and you are left with this windfall of cash. You have to be very careful and very thorough in determining who's going to receive this money, when was this insurance policy taken out. All of these things play into a motive for having somebody killed.
When we looked at the finances, they weren't doing well. They had some debt. They had a lot of overhead.
He had insurance on the bar itself for Patty's life. He had insurance on the truck, and he had insurance on the house. I believe it's over $200,000 insurance.
It's not millions, but what, if your house gets paid for and now you can run your bar, with Patty gone, there's a financial gain for him, and he gets to be with his girlfriend.
Clearly, he had a tremendous financial interest if his wife were to die. And that blows Peter's story right out the window.
Peter thought that he was smarter than the rest of us.
He wanted this to be a motor vehicle accident. And if we know we have a person who's an alcoholic and we find any alcohol in their system, we're gonna go, oh yeah, she was drunk, she drove in the lake. Close the book, let's move on. That's what he expected to have happen. We fell into his web of lies, and it took us a while to get out of him.
Detectives in Shenango County, New York, are ready to charge Peter Wojcik with the brutal murder of his wife, Patty.
We went to his house, he told me he was under arrest for murder. He didn't resist, and then we took him into custody without incident.
Now, District Attorney McBride has to convict him. In court, Peter denies everything, claiming Patty drowned after drinking and driving their truck into the lake.
He argued that it was an accident and that there was no homicide, and they tried to say that we were jumping to conclusions.
He stuck to his story. The problem with that story is there's nothing at the scene that can corroborate what he told us.
He said, apparently, that he was trying to protect her because she had previous episodes of DWI and she had been drinking that night.
Patty was just about 10 years sober by that point. Pete had reintroduced her to alcohol, and he said, just a drink is okay. Once you're sober, you fight it, and you have to, not drink, period. So when Patty told me that Pete said a glass of wine or a beer or a drink would be okay, I said to her, what is your problem? You know better.
She was given alcohol to try to trick law enforcement into believing that she had a DWI accident.
If she was intoxicated, why would he ever let her drive the car? It would make no sense. That did not garner much credibility nor much believability.
During the trial, Peter changes his story again and tries to present himself as the victim.
He said Patty confronted him about the affair and tried to kill him and her as a suicide and drove to the lake intentionally.
Backed by Dr. Terzian's autopsy results and the accident reconstruction, the jury's told what really happened the night Patty died.
She leaves work at 11 o'clock. He was supposed to pick the kids up. She was like, where's the kids? Oh, you forgot them. There was no forgetting. He wanted her alone. He didn't want the kids there. When she got home, he allowed her to drink because he wanted this to be a motor vehicle accident. He attacked her, got her down on the ground. That's where all that Berock's transferred. Well, obviously she fought, but he overpowered her. And then it was probably just a horrible, horrible death.
Dr. Terzian was fantastic. He came, he told to the jury in plain, uncertain terms his analysis, the bruises, and what caused them, including the smothering and the breastplate, that the injuries that were all over her body were inconsistent with the low-speed accident of that truck driving into the lake.
Patty was killed by suffocation. Her blood oxygen level dropped and her heart fibrillated. That's the mechanism. Her husband had asphyxiated her by holding his hand over her nose and mouth, accounting for the trauma to her lips and the blood in the mouth. She died in the yard outside the house, and then her body was placed in the bed of the truck, and then it was covered up by trying to make it look like a drowning.
Mr. Wojcik pulled that truck over to the shoulder, waited for the road to be empty, and gently drove it into the lake.
Pete was not in the vehicle when it went in the water.
Patty's body was floated out. It was found on the bed of the lake. He waited for the truck to sink, went into the lake up to his waist, and then went banging on the doors. I believe the jury got to see the real Peter Wojcik. There were at least 14 pieces of evidence we had that Peter was abusing Patty before the homicide. Peter's motives were, one, to get rid of his wife so that he could be with his girlfriend, that he could get the money that he wanted to expand his business, and he could have primary control of the children.
Facts tend to be very important, for example, to juries. And I'm just trying to inject some facts into the situation. If one looks at the evidence from the autopsy on the scene dispassionately, the chips fall where they may. Patty was murdered.
Peter Wojcik is convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life.
When the verdict came in as guilty, just the feeling of relief that it was done, that he had been convicted, the satisfaction of knowing that he was being held accountable for his behavior. And I remember saying, he did it. That son of a bitch did it. He killed my sister.
I learned a lot from that case. I was fortunate to work with, especially Dr. Jim Turgeon.
It's really a team effort to come up to the proper conclusions. It's not that one person is going to come up with all the answers. We have pieces of the puzzle that need to fit with other pieces of the puzzle.
I miss her. I miss her spunk, her get up and go. Hey, Wendy, let's go. It's things like that. It's the little things that I miss.
Justice was done, that's good, but it's a sad situation, even with him being in jail. You can't say that it was a real win on anybody's side. It's a tragic thing.